All right. First of all, Assalamu alaikum and greetings to everybody who are making time to join us today. First of all, thank you very much for making time. I mean, this is a wonderful and unique event in the sense that we are discussing something that is quite crucial, especially in today's global disorder with a lot of international issues are basically quite messy and full of contradictions, if you like. So, first of all, thank you very much. And of course, I mean, let me just debrief a little bit about the nature of this particular event and introducing myself and my organization as part of the organizer. My name is Imran Muhammad Rasid. I am the Executive Director of Citizen International. Citizen International are basically an NGO based in Malaysia. Our headquarters are in Penang. For those of you who have been to Malaysia, Penang, of course, is going to be a very strategic island that does all kind of things. I mean, Professor lottaz also wrote something about Penang that I can share later in our chat box as well. And this particular lectures is part of our work on doing a lot of advocacy work related to Global South related agenda. Obviously, our core business as Citizen Internationals are related to advocating the agenda of the Global South, building networks and coalitions among the Global South members that cut across not just among the states, but also among the civil societies, business sectors, etc., etc. And I think there is a critical importance today to develop a confidence of sort that allowed us to sort of take this opportunity in today's conjuncture to engage and develop a better world that are fairer, more sustainable, and more just. And just to give you a brief of elaborations as well, last week, Prof. Also, we did a lecture with Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram, talking about the issues of the imperialism, global peace, and global disorder. And at the very end of his lecture, he talked about the importance of invoking and revitalizing non-alignment, which I think is a very core subject that I think you are going to cover as well as part of your rediscussions of neutrality as an active sovereignty in the multipolar world. So this is part of our Global South series. I mean, we are organizing a couple of series as well, including a South-South cooperation series, looking at more sort of interactions and relationship between the private sectors in terms of exchanging technology that are more beneficial for the Global South, as well as a multiversity series, which is more on the decolonial tangent that looks at the intellectual thoughts, theory, conversation that challenge the Western and European hegemony of academic discourses. Again, all of you, thank you very much for coming. I don't want to take too much of your time as well. So without further ado, I would like to pass this session to our moderator, Huzal Muhammad, a research director for Palestine Center of Excellence, PACE, to conduct the sessions.
Right. Assalamualaikum and a very good evening, everyone. I'm Huzal bin Muhammad Nursiak from Palestine Center of Excellence, PACE, will be moderating our program today. So before we begin, let me just introduce a bit on our speaker today. So introducing Dr. Pascal lottaz. Dr. Pascal lottaz is the adjunct researcher at Waseda Institute for Advanced Study based in Tokyo, if I'm not mistaken. Am I right?
Almost. I'm an associate professor at Kyoto University. That Tokyo was my previous affiliation, but close.
Okay. And Dr. Pascal lottaz is also an adjunct professor for European politics at Temple University, Japan. Right?
Not anymore, but also previous.
Not anymore.
Thank
Okay.
you.
All right. And the educational background of Dr. Pascal lottaz, you received a PhD from National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS, and you are leading the research network, neutralitystudies.com, and recently published a book entitled Sweden, Japan, and the Long Second World War, published under Routledge 2022, and some other very prominent and academic books. And about our discussion today, let me introduce Dr. Munirah Alatas. So Dr. Sharifah Munirah Alatas is an independent scholar, author, researcher, and Dr. Munirah was a former Deputy Director and Principal Research Fellow at the Alliance Center for Governance in University Malaya. And a bit of Dr. Munira's academic background. Like Dr. Munira received her doctorate in history from Columbia University in New York City in 1997. And Dr. Munira's area of research or specialties is in geopolitics, decoloniality, post-colonialism, and non-Western IR theory. Right. So welcome everyone to today's session. We will be hearing a lecture and discuss on the topic of neutrality as active sovereignty, where we will see how throughout the history we have during the Cold War era and so on and so forth, there's a group of countries that choose to be in a non-alliance, and we will see further from the explanation and presentation from Dr. Pascal Lottaz. I pass to Dr. Pascal Lottaz. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for first for the kind invitation and for showing up for this presentation. I was a little bit surprised to get your invitation, but overall, it makes complete sense why you might be interested in this topic. And as we go through my presentation, I hope it will become clear why I think it makes sense that, especially in Southeast Asia and with the core in Malaysia, you might be today interested in thinking about, again, neutrality, non-alignment, and kind of this phenomenon that you would like to somehow stay clear of the big alliances. One of the core issues of my presentation will be trying to give you a framework to think about this. Neutrality, when we talk about it, often the only thing that comes to mind is maybe Switzerland and a couple of European states, but one of the core contestation of what I will talk about here is that no, it's in fact a universal phenomenon of international relations. And if we think of it as such, we can actually make it quite useful, and hopefully going forward, then also use it as a way to contribute to peaceful international relations. So let me start. I will do three things. I will first give you a theoretical framework through which I would propose that it makes sense to think about neutrality. Again, often the stereotype is just like, neutrality means doing nothing, sitting back and just letting the world happen, and you yourself then come out of your little shell once you're done. But actual neutrality, the way that it worked in the past and is still working today, is completely different, and I'll talk about that. And I'll give a couple of examples also from the global south. I didn't pick Malaysia, although I could have done so. You've got also a lot of neutrality history yourself, and maybe in the Q&A we can then talk about that one too. So I will use three case studies: Oman, India, and Switzerland. Maybe we have to drop the last one, but luckily Switzerland is also the least interesting. The other two are way more instructive to when it comes to today. And then we will go into a conclusion. Overall, let's start with this question. Look, is neutrality even still relevant in the multipolar world? I wrote another book, or edited a book together with a couple of others back in 2022. This came out right when the enlargement of the Ukraine war happened around February, March 2022. It was quite a dramatic kind of timing for this. I wrote also a couple of other articles, and some of you might know that I also have a YouTube channel on which I talk about neutrality and geopolitics quite often. In my talk right now, I will make three arguments. First, neutrality doesn't go away, but it changes. And the change is what we need to look at and study. Neutrality is anywhere and everywhere a reaction to conflict. Sometimes we think that neutrality is just being peaceful, but in fact, it's a child of conflict and war. And last but not least, the nature of the conflicts will impact the way that neutrality develops and will develop also in the 21st century. And I'll go into all of these. Maybe the first one, neutrality doesn't go away, but it changes. If you go through the neutrality literature, and there's quite a bit of it, and I highly recommend it if any one of you is interested. I have a lot of PDFs that I can send to you if you want to read up on neutrality studies and what other people over the centuries have written about it. It's mostly, unsurprisingly, from Western scholars because colonialism. And it is neutrality itself, as it exists in international law, is a Western concept. However, it is also a universal kind of phenomenon of international relations. And especially since the Second World War, we have very, very important contributions also from the global south, even if they are not might not be as famous when it comes to the international law part, but we'll get into that. Already in 1953, one of the most important scholars of neutrality, Niels Ervik, wrote a book called The Decline of Neutrality, and he looked at the period 1914 to 41. In 1997, we had a Swiss compatriot of mine who wrote this book, Sackgasse Neutralität. Sackgasse means dead end. Neutrality as a dead end. The whole argument was that now that the Cold War is over, nobody needs neutrality anymore, and neutrality will go away. And in 2023, you had the foreign policy, people in foreign policy and other magazines write articles like this one. I'll just pick out one. Why neutrality is obsolete in the 21st century. It keeps repeating. Like the people call it like a gone concept, something that doesn't matter anymore, and time again it actually gets resurrected, or it just again changes its shape. One thing that is important, again, also for my last argument, is when you look at the way that also neutral states develop, they usually come up as a reaction to some wars. So the Napoleonic Wars gave rise to Swiss neutrality after 1815, the Belgian Revolution to Belgian neutrality in the 1830s. World War I gave rise to Danish and Norwegian neutrality, but those then disappeared again in the Second World War, while the Second World War itself created Irish, Spanish, Portuguese, and Turkish neutrality. But after the war was done, also many of these countries just left their neutrality again. And in the Cold War, you then had Austria, Finland, and Yugoslavia that became either neutral or non-aligned. So one thing that I can tell you from these observations is, conflicts kill a couple of neutralities, but they always give rise to new ones. So we having a fluctuation of what countries are neutral and not is actually a very normal thing. Just because some go away doesn't mean that the phenomenon is gone. So what do we mean when we talk about neutrality? On the highest level, of course, we can talk about neutral countries. And we could talk about, there are a couple of other ways to look at it, but let's assume that for a moment that we're looking at the country level. There we've got countries that have an official policy of neutrality, and within that category, you then have countries with neutrality in their constitution or their foreign policy. Switzerland and Austria are an example of those. You also have countries that have simply a foreign policy of non-alignment, but that do not spell it out in their national codes. So Austria and Switzerland have the word neutrality in the constitution. Sweden and Finland were examples that didn't have the word in the constitution. They just had for the longest time such a foreign policy, and they used the word. They, especially before the 2000s, they used to call their foreign policy one of neutrality. But then on the other hand, we also can look at something that I would claim is even more useful for international relations students, and that is to think of neutrality as an analytical category. What do I mean by that? I mean by this that we can simply look at the actions of a couple of countries and the way that they position themselves in international relations, and then we can just call that neutrality, even if those countries themselves don't call it such. We can use it as a way in order to understand how a group of countries, some, not all, but some countries, act in international relations. And within that group, we have neutralist strategies, so countries that explicitly try to do what I will present in just a moment, to kind of play with both sides. And we also have countries in which you find neutrality discourse. So we can look at activist groups, for instance, that say that, oh, our country should actually become neutral. Let's have activities about this. Let's try to make these countries neutral. And we have more of those than you would think. Even over time, you had a neutralist movement in Japan, you had a neutralist movement in Germany, you have one now in Germany, you have a neutralist movement at the moment in Colombia, you have neutralist movements in even in Australia at the moment. They are not very big, but you can find these kind of groups of people that keep arguing that, look, we need to prospectively change the foreign policy of this country toward some form of neutrality. And I think when we sit here together, we're actually thinking along also those lines. You can also study and look at neutrality of non-state actors. This is something that's relatively new within neutrality studies, but there are a couple of very important examples where not only countries use a policy of neutrality, but also non-state actors. Maybe the most famous and most important one is the International Committee of the Red Cross. They very famously have a policy of neutrality in order to deliver the services or the kind of humanitarian work that they have to do. But there are others. There are other humanitarian organizations, also Doctors Without Borders, that in one form or another are sometimes forced into a neutral position in order to access people on the battlefield and deliver, humanitarian aid to all sides of a conflict. And I'll get to why that is important in a moment. But so when I talk about neutrality, I also mainly talk now about neutrality as an analytical category. And here is the framework that I would like to propose to you in order to think about neutrality a little bit more usefully. Because sometimes, we tend to use the image of a weighing scale when we think of neutrality, right? So the neutral is in the middle, and then on the left hand, there's one belligerent, and on the right hand, there's another belligerent, and the neutral is kind of squeezed and a fence sitter and needs to evaluate what to do with both of these belligerents. And that mental image, I would argue, is not a productive one, because it actually obstructs and camouflages maybe the most important thing about neutrals, and that is that they are actors in their own right. So I would propose that you actually don't use the weighing scale and being in the middle as a mental image, but the triangle. Because one thing is very important about international relations, and that is that the relationships of countries amongst each other are inherently bilateral. What do I mean with that? Even in conflict, what we usually find is that you have a belligerent one and a belligerent two, B1 and B2, and those, and you also have third-party actors. I call them A. And third party actor A, of course, has a relationship with B1, has a relationship with B2, and B2 and B1 with each other. Now, when there is a conflict or even a war, what happens is that the relationship between B1 and B2 is one of, well, warfare. They do not communicate anymore through normal diplomatic means, or don't have normal international communication with each other, but they drop bombs. Like Iran and the United States and Israel at the moment, right? Israel and US on one side, Iran on the other, and they communicate through bombs. They have the worst kind of the degeneration of bilateral relationship that in IR you can have. However, the relationships then of the neutral actor with both belligerents, and this is very important, continues as it was before. They remain at peace. Here on my little diagram with a peace sign to illustrate it. So, and this itself here is the basic constellation of what then creates a lot of headaches and a lot of problems for the neutral. Now, one thing that's interesting is that if we look at it in terms of the relationships that these countries have, actually at the moment, there is no neutrality in this system. There's really only peace and war, right? The neutral being at peace with two sides and the two sides being at war with each other. The neutrality of the neutral actor is actually something that lies within the system, right? The neutral actor is actually neutral toward the conflict. The neutral actor is not neutral toward the belligerents. With the belligerents, the neutral actor is simply at peace because no beef, right? They have no beef with the belligerents. Unfortunately, the belligerents have beef with each other. So the main problem for any neutral actor is always that its partners with whom the neutral is at peace are at war with each other. So neutrals are literally friends with enemies, or friends with those who are enemies to each other. Now, what I also encourage you to think of is that although neutrals by definition try to remain at a distance from a conflict and try not to be sucked into a conflict, it is essential that they are actually part of what I call a conflict constellation, right? This is part and parcel, because belligerent 1 and belligerent 2, and this can be a hot war when fighting is actually occurring like Russia and Ukraine, or Iran and the United States, or it can be a cold war when there is basically a big economic contest between two sides. It doesn't matter. Whenever you have conflict, both conflict parties will try to influence the neutral, and they will try to tell the neutral, look, you have to be more on my side because obviously I'm the good party, and you should not support my enemy. When international relations really turns bad, countries then even do things like the United States in the Second World War, and they have a Trading with the Enemy Act, and they just apply that to the neutral third party, saying like, hey, by the way, you're not allowed to trade with my enemy, otherwise you're in breach with my domestic law. That's usually the point where then neutrals try to say like, hey, listen, I understand that you're at war with the other one, but your domestic law is not my law. So I have my own relationship with the other one. And often, especially in the West, this is something that they simply don't understand. And I will show you an example of that in a moment. So long story short, the point is neutrals are not part of the conflict. They are neutral toward the conflict, but they will always be embedded in a conflict constellation that will create problems on them as well. And that's just what it is. Neutrals cannot escape the conflict constellation as little as others can escape these conflicts once they happen. If you completely escape the conflict constellation, then you're in fact, in my framing, not neutral anymore, but you're completely uninvolved. An example would be, of course, think about the position of the Maya Empire during the wars between France and Britain 800 years ago. The Maya Empire somewhere in South America was obviously not involved, but it makes little sense to talk of them as neutrals because they were not in touch with the conflict itself. There was no interaction happening. But as soon as an interaction between actors take place, and as soon as they have a relationship with each other, neutrals are automatically part of the conflict constellation, but they will try to remain at an arm's length from the conflict itself. So if you want to put this into modern Twitter parlance, I would say that's called #NotMyWar, which is usually what the neutrals try to tell the belligerents to leave them alone. Or if you want to use the words of one of the great ancient thinkers in Greece, Mr. Thucydides, he gave a beautiful definition of neutrality 2,400 years ago. He called it being friend to all and foe to neither, or foe to nobody and friends to everybody, right? And this to me breaks it down really to its core, because that's at the end of the day what neutrals try to convince all belligerents of, that they're their friends, while, again, not the enemy of the other one. It creates then these problems, but you see how today some states naturally adopt that position. And I would like to point your attention to the position of Oman. Oman, literally in its foreign policy homepage, and I just checked earlier today again, they still do that. They have part of their foreign policy homepage here where they say that the foreign policy of the Sultanate of Oman is founded on a profound and enduring vision of Oman as a friend to all, a friend to all. The vision embraces dialogue and tolerance as guiding principles in addressing all issues. It is a vision of peace in which Oman plays an active part in a regional community of nations living in harmony in relationship, which assures security and stability while fostering the economic growth and cultural development essential to all our futures. And I didn't show the other page of Oman, where they actually say that, well, sometimes we have the most important thing to us is our immediate neighbors, but unfortunately, our immediate neighbors are sometimes at conflict with each other. But we as Oman will try to maintain as friendly a relationship with each one of them. And they explicitly enumerate the other Gulf states and Iran in their on that other page. Now, you might interject, but Pascal, like, what about what recently happened? So on the one hand, Oman has for many years now been playing a diplomatic mediator between also the United States and Iran in order to facilitate the negotiations, especially in the last couple of years. But this goes back many years. Oman has been trying to be open as a diplomatic service provider of last resort, because of course Iran and the United States ever since 1979 didn't have diplomatic relations with each other, right? But Oman was always one of the places where diplomacy was still possible. Problem, of course, that also Oman was hit by Iran in the war that is going on as we speak. What about that? Well, here I have something to say, which is that that Iran itself, actually the official Iran, the diplomacy of Iran actually apologized for those, and it said that yes, some ports and some infrastructure in Oman was hit, but that this is not done as part of state policy. And this to me is quite important. So in this tweet here, Iran's foreign minister Arakchi said literally that what happened in Oman was not our choice. We have already told our armed forces to be careful about the targets they choose. Sorry, the point I want to make here is that in what recently happened in these strikes that Oman was hit has more to do with the operational way in which Iran is conducting the war, because Iran doesn't have a central command. It actually empowered 31 of its military districts to choose and then implement strikes by themselves, and that Oman is in this sense has been kind of on the in a strange form of collateral damage. Actually, it wasn't the intention of especially the central leadership in Tehran to target Oman. Hence, also the apologies that came from the government about Oman being struck by Iranian drones and missiles. Although from all the Gulf states, Oman is definitely the one that was struck the least. If you compare it to what happened to Qatar, Bahrain, or the UAE, Oman basically really only was targeted when one of these lower level military districts didn't properly understand that Oman is basically a friend and not a foe, and they always targeted basically the US shipping or US shipping linked ports within Oman. Now we can talk more about this in the discussion. I just want to point this out, that within the Gulf states, Oman is probably the closest to a neutral, although Oman itself never calls itself neutral. And I had a discussion with the Omani ambassador here in Japan a while ago, and he told me, look, we are not neutral. We are more than neutral. We are friend to all. So he or Oman doesn't conceive itself as neutral, but in my framework, or how I encourage you to think about it, it is, for all intents and purposes, an analytical, playing this neutral role in the analytical sense. Now, if we look, what I presented here, this basic constellation, is actually the kind of neutrality that is valid for any kind of conflict or any kind of country toward any kind of conflict. If you think of the current position of Malaysia toward the US-Iran war, you would find that Malaysia is basically also in the same position, right? Malaysia would be actor A, and Malaysia maintains a relationship with Iran, and it of course maintains a relationship also with the United States. So in international law, actually this is also something that applies in what we call the law of neutrality, that actors that are not choosing to actively be involved in the war automatically count as neutral. So even in the framework of international law, this relationship here holds. Although, of course, Malaysia doesn't need to declare its neutrality in order for that then to be valid. We do have other examples of neutral countries, like the permanently neutral countries like Switzerland, for instance, or Austria or Ireland, that promise to be always neutral, not only in a currently ongoing conflict, but in the future. And for that one, I have this somewhat very confusing picture here, just to say that if we talk about permanently neutral countries that also have this as part of the foreign policy, then usually what the picture looks like for them is like this. They of course have a lot of relationships with a lot of countries, every other country, and knowing that any one of these countries in the future might end up in a war with one of the others, they just preemptively promise neutrality also in the future. So this is maybe one of the differences between what we call permanent neutrality and my example from before, occasional neutrality, when you basically on the basis of an existing war, when countries choose whether they maintain neutrality or not. Again, examples for permanent neutral states are Switzerland, Austria, Ireland, but there are a couple of others, Malta as well, Costa Rica as well, that again use it as a foreign policy. Then neutrality is anywhere and everywhere a reaction to conflict, my argument number 2. Here, I would like to point out that we have basically 2 paradigms under which we can think about international relations. One is a very typical Western paradigm that was coined many years ago, just war theory, which you then find again and again and again also in modern international parlance. Probably the most recent resurrection was a couple of years ago in the so-called responsibility to protect, but it's much older. This idea that whenever there is a conflict in international relations, whenever there's a war, then one party must be guilty and the other party must be just. And if you're not with us, you're against us. Of course, George Bush Jr.'s famous dictum, right? With us or against us in the Iraq war, in the war on terror, through which they then invaded Afghanistan. In a with us or against us world, under the just war paradigm, there is very little space for neutrality. This is also something that often happens, and that especially Western countries do time and time again, that they create a binary and saying like, well, good or bad, with us or against us, choose. And under that paradigm, of course, there's very little space for neutrality. There's another paradigm in IR, which is much more conducive, and that's that of Mr. Clausewitz, the famous Prussian general who coined the phrase, war is the continuation of politics by other means. Now, if you look at war as a political instrument, then suddenly space for neutrality opens, because then being neutral, if war is the continuation of politics by other means, then neutrality is the continuation of politics by the same means. And the realists of the Clausewitzian type, who do not look at war as good or bad in a moral framework, they are usually it's much easier to tell them why some countries, sometimes a lot of countries, choose neutrality. Because it makes sense to them, because there's no point in choosing who you want to support. Clausewitzian realists understand that. George W. Bush type of moralist and essentially Christian thinkers often do not understand it, because obviously if you're not with us, you're with evil, and if you're with evil, then, well, you're evil yourself. So you see, it depends really on how we conceive about the nature of conflict and war, of whether there is mental space for neutrality or not. I will skip this one here, because I would let's go to the map of how it changed a bit also over the last couple of years in this book called Beyond the neutral beyond the cold. We made the case that for all the countries that you see here on this map, you had back in 2020, 2021, some form of neutrality going on, either neutrality discourse in the light green ones, or actual neutrality policies. I mean, even Turkmenistan here, by the way, has a very strong neutrality in its constitution and foreign policy that it is also very, very proud of. The Mongolia was discussing neutrality for the longest time. There were neutralist associations in the Koreas, and of course Southeast Asia, that has a very long tradition of non-alignment on the one hand, and non-alignment was one of the champions of non-alignment is the Indonesians, of course, with Mr. Suharto, who championed this with the non-aligned movement. But also Malaysia. Malaysia is the one who championed actually the word neutrality in kind of a rival concept to what the Indonesians created, and that's the zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, ZOPFAN. And ZOPFAN still today is one of the essential pillars of ASEAN foreign policy. Now, ASEAN is of course, not the strongest of all international organizations, but that's also a good thing. But it is still part and parcel of how also Southeast Asia is going about one part of its foreign policy. Then, of course, well, let's just look. I mean, this kind of, I think this cartoon should resonate quite a bit, especially with you in Malaysia, right? When you're stuck there and you're kind of put to the choice: do you want the Chinese bully or do you want the US bully? And both of them say like, pick one. Well, that's this triangular dilemma that I was talking about before, right? That creates itself. If we look at especially Europe, how this developed in the last couple of years, the sad story is, of course, that we lost quite a lot of neutrals. And I just want to point this out, right? Ukraine. There was a neutrality option on the table for Ukraine for the entire time, ever since the 1990s. And I have articles about this, how even within Ukraine, it was not only discussed, but Ukraine had neutrality principles also in its constitution. And those were systematically undermined and in the end thrown away back in 2014 when the coup happened on the Maidan. In the West, you usually hear that Mr. Yanukovych was a pro-Russian president, but that's nonsense. He was simply pro-neutrality. He wanted Ukraine to be a bridge between Russia and Europe, and unfortunately, other people inside Ukraine who wanted to use Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia, unfortunately, they won the political discussion. Mr. Yanukovych lost power, and Ukraine was transformed into a bulwark against Russia instead of having a connecting bridge. And the neutrality of Ukraine, including, of course, Crimea, was the most obvious of all solutions. And it was tried and it was attempted time and time again up until 2022, April 2022, when Mr. Zelensky basically already had initialed a document that said that, okay, Ukraine would now be neutral and Russia would stop the aggression, but that never materialized for different reasons that we cannot discuss here. But it was made impossible, and I tell you, it was made impossible from the West. It was made impossible from London and from Washington. They told the Ukrainians to go and fight and keep fighting, and that's one of the sources of a lot of very horrible things that then followed, and it is unnecessary. We know that this neutrality of Ukraine would have worked, and a lot of realists, most importantly John Mearsheimer, were saying so for a long time. But well, we lost these countries, unfortunately, and now we have an even more heated international relations environment in Europe, and one that is actually still spiraling toward more war. So eliminating neutrals from the map does not help to de-escalate international relations. On the other hand, I also want to point this out. If we look at the map that is more than just Europe, we actually see that 2/3 of the world, more or less, in the analytical sense, chose neutrality, because you see all the countries that chose not to send weapons, neither to Ukraine nor to Russia, I mean, I should put Russia in a different category here, Russia and Belarus. But I think the idea is clear. Like when we look at the track record of other nations, we see that a lot of countries chose not to one-sidedly support one or the other, but to basically maintain an arm's length distance. The most important one, and I will probably end with this one, is the case study of India. And I do hope that you can hear my computer audio, because there's this fascinating discourse between this host here and Mr. Jaishankar, the foreign minister of India. That was back in late 2022, I believe, when this discussion took place. And I will play this. It's a 3-minute clip. Please listen to this, and just listen also to the framing that's coming from her, and then how he refutes that and how he frames India's foreign policy within the context of this Russia-Ukraine war.
I want to come back to a question.
You can hear it, right?
The crux of the question, which I asked a few people in the political circles, in the financial circles. What's your big question? And one of the foremost geopolitical strategists on Wall Street sent me this question for you. Mm-hmm. And the question is simple. If and when the choice comes down to it, not today, not tomorrow, but in the future, and she strongly believes it will, for India, will it become, in terms of support, the US or China? And that will be kind of a defining moment that comes out of the situation that we face with Russia right now.
Look, number one, why I wanted to interrupt you in a way. I mean, I'm partly reacting to the previous observation. Somewhere Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems. But the world's problems are not Europe's problems. That if it is you, it's yours. If it is me, it's ours. I think that's something, and I see, reflections of that. Again, in terms of, there is a linkage today which is being made. A linkage between China and India and what's happening in Ukraine. So come on, guys. I mean, China and India happened way before anything happened in Ukraine. So the Chinese don't need a precedent somewhere else in the world on how to, engage us or not engage us, or be difficult with us or not be difficult with us. So as I said, I mean, I just see this as frankly a not very clever argument, a very self-serving one. This idea that, your grand strategy must be about how you will choose. I will do what, as all of us do, I will weigh the situation, everybody, after all, how do countries eventually make decisions?
There will always be two axes at this point. I think it's an understood, accepted fact that you have the West, US-led, you have China as the next potential axis. Where does India fit into this? But are you planning to not?
No, I'm sorry. That is exactly where I disagree with you. This is the construct you are trying to impose on me, and I don't accept it. I mean, I don't think it's necessary for me to join this axis or not, and if I'm not joining this, I must be with the other one. I don't accept it. I mean, I think I'm 1/5 of the world's population. I'm today the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. I mean, forget the history, civilization bit, everybody knows that. But I think I'm entitled to have my own side. I'm entitled to weigh my own interests, make my own choices. And my choices will not be cynical and transactional, but they will be a balance of my values and my interests. There is no country in the world which disregards its interests.
I want.
He was making similar points like several times. This is one of the recurring kind of things that Mr. Jaishankar has to explain.
A lot of Americans still have that NATO treaty construct in their heads. The reality is that is not a template that applies to India.
The whole point, and this is really difficult, that the selling the idea, especially to the West, that, oh no, wait, there can be third ways. There have been countries historically that understood that, but even they are kind of losing this at the moment. My native Switzerland is one of those. But I know that we are, I'm getting close to the 40-minute mark. Let me just like very quickly talk about what is happening here. You know, Switzerland, when it comes to the Ukraine war, basically, basically said that it will follow a legal neutrality in the hot shooting war, and it didn't export weapons to Ukraine, only humanitarian goods. But when it comes to political support and moral support, Switzerland uses all the same kind of rhetoric about the Ukraine war as the other European states do. And also economically, Switzerland, of course, also put sanctions on Russia. And this is one of the reasons why Russia is actually saying Switzerland is also a non-friendly country. We don't accept the Swiss anymore as a neutral mediator or a neutral actor. So the Swiss keep saying that legally speaking, we're neutral, because legally speaking, according to the Hague conventions, we just have to maintain neutrality when it comes to arms sales. Well, yeah, that's nice and good, but that doesn't help you in your international perception, right? Of who views you as part of a conflict or who not. Sorry, and by the way, the reason I put the middle picture here, it's like that was one of the first times back in 2023 or 24, I think, that one of our Swiss, the minister of she was minister not of foreign affairs, of the defense, minister of defense. She met with the then NATO General Secretary, Mr. Stoltenberg, at the NATO headquarters for a photo op and participating in NATO in NATO discussions. So it is just one of the examples for, you know, how even neutral countries in Europe at the moment are actually getting further and further sucked in to the entire conflict that is going on. But maybe let me just leave it at that. At the same time, though, in Switzerland this year, in September or October, we're going to have a referendum, because there's a citizen initiative that forces now the government to vote, to let the Swiss population vote about writing a definition of their neutrality into the constitution. The Swiss constitution currently mentions the word neutrality twice, but it doesn't define it. And there's a citizen initiative that actually succeeded in gathering enough signatures so that the government is now forced to, they have to mandatorily run a referendum. And if enough people say yes, more than 50%, then Switzerland will have a new definition of neutrality, which will actually would include economic neutrality as well on top of military neutrality. So we see that how overall at the moment we're still within history. History isn't over at all. And also in countries like Switzerland and countries like India, the debate about what is a reasonable foreign policy goes on and on. And of course, we also could have talked about Malaysia too, and about even more about ASEAN, but maybe we can do that in the discussion. Overall, in conclusion, I leave you with this observation: neutrality is currently moving out of Europe, but into other parts of the world, to which I would actually include Malaysia very much. Also looking at the previous presidency of ASEAN, what Malaysia did there. Countries with hard neutrality laws keep their foreign policy more readily than those without. This is what happened to Sweden and Finland. They were able to get rid of their foreign policies of neutrality quite easily, among others, because it wasn't in their constitution. Most developing nations are trying to maintain multi-directional foreign policies. You don't necessarily need to agree that neutrality is the best term to analytically frame the foreign policy of India or of Malaysia. You can use different terms, multi-directional foreign policies, or omnipartial, or multi-partial, whatever you want. The idea, I would claim, is still the same: be friends with all and foe to neither, or foe to none. And just keep your options open with everybody and not just with one or the other side of a conflict. And in the coming multipolar system, we should probably expect more neutrality policies, not less, but adapted to the conflicts they will be directed toward. The nature of the conflicts will determine the nature of the neutrality that we will see. So let's analyze what these conflicts are and how to have a beneficial neutrality that can help de-escalate conflicts rather than making them worse. And with that, I leave you and let's start a discussion. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you so much, Dr. Pascal, for in-depth and extensive explanation on neutrality. I bet that every one of us have a lot of questions and to ask. But before we go to Q&A, let's see the opinions and discussions from Dr. Munira Alatas. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Pascal. That was very detailed. And as a discussant, I'm not going to do as good a job as you did. However, I think I may discuss a little bit more about a Southeast Asian perspective. Generally, an analytical observation of state behavior in our region, and this phenomenon of third party politics, which I think is an important one. Now, active neutrality or non-alignment represents basically not a deviation, and I think you've mentioned this, but a somewhat proactive expression of sovereign agency. I think that the term agency is very important when you talk about the context of neutral behavior. Agency meaning it is not inactive, not a fence sitter. It adds to how we study international relations, and I think this is a shortcoming in many of our IR programs in the region, and specifically in the context of Malaysia, I would say, and the evolving within the evolving phenomenon of global IR. We are heading towards what Amitav Acharya calls multiplex world order, and I tend to gravitate towards that kind of thinking when we look at world order, but I won't get into that right now. But I do share your desire to implement more of these approaches of neutrality studies to center it within the IR as a sub-discipline of IR as theoretically legitimate. It's a legitimate field of inquiry in IR. And it actually contributes to understanding how the global majority actually thinks about world order. And I think the idea of neutrality is being subdued somewhat. At least the idea is how you have presented and how I agree with. Now, the main points of my discussion, I think, will be 4 or 5 points. Again, as I mentioned, from a Southeast Asian perspective. And in this context, I would like to highlight mainstream, what mainstream IR discourse tends to marginalize about world order in the context of discussing power, peace, war, and how culture and historical tradition actually have a very active role to play. And this includes also self-perception, how states perceive themselves, the role of non-state actors in decision-making about foreign policy, again, that has the role of identity that plays in it. Belief systems, very often left out in the classroom when you're teaching IR. You don't talk about religion, for instance, and other forms of belief systems, and other intangible values that shape how states interact with each other. I think this is very important to address when we contextualize discourses on neutrality, because it often gravitates towards it being state-centric. And I think one more point about the hashtag #NotMyWar, which you mentioned in your presentation. I would like to bring up the moral, I put that in inverted commas, the moral dimension of neutrality. But I'm not going to, it's not moral in the normal sense, okay, in the acceptable sense. It's another angle of looking at what moral dimension I'm referring to. Also, at the end of my discussion, I actually have two questions I'd like to pose for you, but also for the discussion as well in general, as well as make a statement. But I'll get into that at the end. Now, let me dive into my points. First, about the alignment behavior in the context of Southeast Asia. And of course, that includes most definitely ASEAN. A productive way of observing neutrality in the region would probably be in the following three or four, I think three contexts, okay? Number one is the region's lived experience with colonialism, its colonial legacy. I think that's a very decisive, important factor that shouldn't be left out of this discourse. And the reality of the current presence of big power tensions and rivalry in the region. And this is it's not military conflict per se, but it's geoeconomic, it's geopolitical, and it's geostrategic. And that's the reality. And Southeast Asia's and ASEAN's centrality and active sovereignty is the reaction to these realities. Again, I think I read somewhere in one of your articles, I must say I've just been recently introduced to your website as well, the Neutrality Studies website. So I haven't had time to go through it, but I have read a couple of your articles. And the idea that neutrals occupy a third space, I think that's very, very important. And it goes in line with what India has just, your clip, the short clip of the Foreign Minister of India said. The third space, okay, neutrals are friendly with all, friendly with both or all the belligerent parties in a conflict situation, but they are not passive or aloof. And I think the constant impression given about neutral states, and especially when in the context of Southeast Asia, and maybe in the context of many countries in the global majority, the developing countries, the idea is that neutrality means passivity or being aloof, not strong enough to take a stand, not willing to participate with agency, which is completely wrong, especially when you look at the history of ASEAN and the history of Southeast Asia as a region. And for that, I would say neutrality is basically a very natural, organic, geographical development for centuries in the region, for centuries in Southeast Asia. Historically, we in this area, in this region, have had to deal with, have had to manage big powers in our backyard. I mean, the Chinese dynasties for centuries have been we've had to look over our shoulders for that. Indian kingdoms, trading communities from Persia, from West Asia, there has been constant engagement of external entities with the region. So this historical tradition, I would say, continues right up till today, and it has shaped our region's neutral approach to interstate relations. I mean, it's the only way to go. We cannot be closed off. We depend on the external, on external engagement. At the same time, we're not naive to think that external engagement will not bring any conflict. So we've had to maneuver how to accommodate everyone at the same time for our benefit. So sovereignty in this sense, now I don't know if I'm going to be using the correct adjective, sovereignty is treated casually, okay? Casually in the sense that a big power which would naturally be a threat, we decide to engage it rather than be on the defensive. So in that sense, it gives us the agency to bring into dialogue. So sovereignty as casual agency is probably how I see it. And this is to not take the aggressive defensive approach, which is you are with us, either with us or against us. And I think this is the crux of it. The strategy prioritizes being friendly to everyone, which is in many of our regions, the nations in our region, it's part of the foreign policy. And this to me, now I'm going to say, again, use the word moral, and we can talk about this later. It is our way of achieving a moral balance. And I agree with you. It's not in the sense of a weighing scale, because a weighing scale actually masks the notion of agency. And that's how I look at it. It's not to subdue our active agency while being neutral, but it dismisses the idea of fence sitting. Now I'm going to go to a different discussion now, sort of the connected with the legacy of colonialism, and why discourses in neutrality must be grounded in the legacy of colonialism that the region has experienced, together with discourses on imperialism, hegemony, and exploitation. I mean, we cannot remove the stance that countries take towards big power conflict without linking it with our experience of being dominated by big powers. So I feel that, maybe we tend to focus on colonialism as sociologists or historians, but within IR discourse, it's a growing discourse, but I think it needs to be stressed a lot more, especially now, since 2023, since October 2023, and right now, given the current violence that's taking place in West Asia. And the foundational ideology or idea of neutrality in the region, in Southeast Asia, and actually among global majority nations, is this solidarity in the shared legacy of oppressive imperialist colonial past that many countries have faced. So link this with the spirit of Bandung and the non-aligned movement. And you have mentioned, of course, it led to Zopfan, which was established in 1971, which proves the region's commitment to being equidistant or I would say multi-alignment, a multi-alignment policy. And this is where states concurrently manage multiple alignments bilaterally. I mean, this is the cornerstone of our neutrality is to manage problems bilaterally, at the same time, in this way, safeguarding national interests. Now, I've also heard the term being used accusatory as a negative way of saying that, oh, so your grand strategy in Southeast Asia within ASEAN, you are non-aligned, but you choose to play the field. I mean, how just is that, playing the field? Well, I mean, you can either phrase the question that way with that kind of connotation, Or you could actually put it nicely and very proudly, well, we are playing the field because it's a proactive strategy of survival. I mean, we do it to survive, not with weapons or not with taking sides with powers that choose to kill and emerge top because of that. So it's searching for opportunities. It's a strategy of survival. And we've done it in the region, as I said, for centuries, and it has worked. And the map you showed of neutral countries not voting about sending weapons, the majority of the countries are the global majority. They are the developing world. So it works. Violence and neutrality don't go together. I think I'll say one more point about concepts that emerge from within the region. Whenever we speak of alignment behavior in and neutrality, okay, we should be aware of and invoke ideas of shared spaces, because this is actually reflected in the region's history. For example, the idea of Nusantara. This is a very critical idea, okay, for the region, because it is the bedrock of diplomatic, economic, social and political activity in the region. Now, to explain, Nusantara is actually a Sanskrit word. You break it down, Nusa means island, and Antara means between. So Nusantara means movement. It invokes the idea, the concept of movement between islands. And this reflects an indigenous perception of the region as a patchwork of shared land and sea spaces. Shared land and sea spaces that humans need to traverse to make a living, to search for sustenance, to trade, for cultural and religious exchange. Basically, it invokes the idea of connection, connecting externally, bringing external, internal. So I think this concept of Nusantara is indigenous, and it basically explains our natural neutral orientation. And this maritime logic actually it links connectivity with neutrality in the sense that the sea is not seen as a military front line. Okay, it's seen instead as a vital conduit for global economic activities, for trade routes, for community and societal sustainability. So it is not a military front line. Now, I think, Pascal, you may be able to shed more light later about how this contrasts with Western historical basin thinking, which basically views the ocean as integrated military blocks, because of the basic concept that the ocean divides. So, you know, I haven't done too much research on that, so maybe we can discuss that. Now, Indonesia's concept, all right, of bebas aktif. Now, this is another concept besides Nusantara. It means independent and active, and it characterizes the strategic individualism within the region, in the sense that within the region, in the Nusantara, we aspire to remain independent, bebas, while at the same time emphasizing being active, not passive neutrals. All right, so bebas active is rooted, I would say, it's definitely rooted in both Malaysia and Indonesian foreign policy, as well as all 11 ASEAN nations. It's not mentioned per se, bebas active, it is worded differently, but the concept is the same. It's a shared concept. And I don't see why we shouldn't be teaching this in classrooms, using indigenous concepts as opposed to just focusing on realist or neoliberal concepts. Now, yeah, bebas active, of course, was a pretext in the discussion of non-alignment and the spirit of Bandung and the formation of ASEAN and later ZOPFAN. So it is the foundational concept of our region's neutrality. Now, I would like to mention this little caveat about the non-aligned movement. Again, this is a criticism. Even though NAM at the beginning, in the 50s, was a push for neutrality, among many countries, Yugoslavia at that time, India, South Africa, Indonesia, it was a push for neutrality. But of course, today, many countries have deviated from this. And I mean, we've seen the number of countries in West Asia, among the Arab world, now are host to US military bases. And from your presentation, except Oman, or Oman tends to be different from the rest. Nevertheless, despite the deviation, I think we need to resurrect it. We need to save it, save the idea, and talk more about it. And that's why I appreciate your research and your center and the publications and the talks you're giving. In fact, I've been following your interviews with Muhammad Marandi on the latest developments. I appreciate that as well. But I think we need to evoke NAM, ZOPFAN, as not just regional values or regional strategies, but invoke the global spirit of non-alignment, because it's our chance now to marginalize what mainstream has been doing for decades. And I would say, as you have mentioned, well, in the last part of my discussion will be about the goals of neutrality, okay? The need to invoke the non-aligned movement, the spirit of Bandung, because of the goals of neutrality, okay? First, I mentioned earlier, the individualistic goals. It's supposed to benefit the third party. Obviously, we become neutrals because we want something out of it. Second, the moral logic of neutrality, and to me, this is really moral, okay? The moral logic of neutrality is actually to make war more difficult to resort to. At the end of the day, what do we want? Whether we are a country in Europe, in South America, or in Southeast Asia, what do we want? We want less wars. And neutrality has the ability to make war more difficult to resort to. I think we tend to believe and accept the idea that the world is divided in a binary. you're either at war or at peace. There's no in between. But again, neutrality is not merely an in between. It is premised on settling disagreements without, in fact, going to war. The moral dimension is that neutrality is a consistent, conscious choice that must be made. And going back to the idea that it is a third space, it's a third space outside the primacy or primary conflicts. Neutral states help quarantine war in that sense. Okay, it quarantines war and weakens the security dilemma. At least that's how it should be seen. It may not be happening in some parts of the world, but again, if you look at Southeast Asia, it seems to be working. Perhaps maybe we can discuss this more with respect to West Asia, that what's happening in West Asia now. Okay, I think I would like to ask my two questions. Okay, the first question is, why has neutrality not been treated as an important subject of inquiry in mainstream IR research and discourse? Okay, it does exist, but to what extent can I get a degree in neutrality studies? Okay, it's simply put question, but I think we might understand where I'm heading. It is such an important concept and notion because it relates to how wars can be avoided. So how are we going to prioritize it? Secondly, why is hedging? I've read many places, hedging as a neutral behavior. Why is hedging considered an imperfect approach? I mean, one can criticize for the sake of criticizing, obviously, but is there any truth in the fact that it's imperfect? Now, again, having said the word imperfect, in world order discourse, nothing is perfect. I understand that. But if you can relate the discussion of imperfection to the fact that it reduces conflict, that would be good enough. And please allow me to make one statement, okay, before I end. While the era we are currently in, it's transforming, right? I think we are in a post-Cold War era, but it seems to be transitioning. It seems more like a neo-colonial era right now, from the point of view of the global majority. But in this context, okay, the fact that we are no longer in the in the post-Cold War and transitioning towards a neo-colonial era, and this is not just from the perspective of international relations, it's from the perspective of many issues on politics, on education, which is my passion. We are being treated as neo-colonial colonies, many of us in the global majority, okay? In this context, neutrality should not be on the decline as a topic of discussion, of discourse. It should not be. In fact, if anything, it should be resurrected. And in fact, it should induce more attention for it, for international relations as a discipline, as a theoretical study of how states interact. Okay, I think I don't have anything else to say. Thank you once again, Pascal, for your presentation. It was very informative.
Well, thank you so much.
Prof, can I interfere just a little bit before we proceed with the answers from Pascal, Dr. Pascal? anyone who have questions, you can message me privately in the Zoom, and after Dr. Pascal answered Dr. Munira's questions, and I will call the name, and you can just ask the question out loud to any of our speakers or discussants. Thank you so much, please, Dr. Pascal.
Well, thank you very, very much. And you've already have also a lot of good comments and questions in the chat box. And really, like Dr. Lottaz, thank you so much for all of these thoughts, which are really important. So maybe let me just address the first one. Why do we not study it anymore? We don't study it because it has been crowded out. Modern international relations has, by the way that it approaches international relations, crowded out an older version of what IR used to be. You know, IR itself as a discipline was born in 1919 after the First World War. The first chair was somewhere, I think it was at Oxford, and that was the first time somebody suggested, let's study the international world, like, you know, as an international relations, as a phenomenon, sociological phenomenon. And that IR was quite different. The first chair who held that looked at the world quite differently. And then the modern IR, as we know it today, is the child of the post-Second World War, when the center of IR moved from the UK moved to the United States. And everything we study today, we study under this lens because that's just kind of, you know, together with the United States as a hegemon, it also imposed its hegemonic way of framing international relations. So we are framing those who do not choose as fence-sitters or as hedging. Hedging implies this kind of idea, you know, you hedge between two options, right? So you're not decided, you're undecisive. So, you know, it already implies this kind of moral failure. And that is something very, very Western to do, which is why I actually think that the future of neutrality studies is actually going to be in the global South, because this decolonial aspect is so fundamental. Because actually the Europeans and North Americans, they lack the ability, and I really think it's an inability to frame the world outside of binaries, because this is a very Christian and Catholic problem actually, and it has been imported in the way that the Euro-Americans basically conceive of the world. But again, this is not conducive to neutrality. The conducive part is when you realize that you have exactly what you refer to, shared spaces. And actually, the birth of modern neutrality law was not on land, it was on the sea. It was 800 years ago in the Mediterranean, the Consolato del Mare, because back then you had this problem that these states go to war with each other every once in a while. But you know what? In the Mediterranean, the traders wanted to trade. They wanted to exchange goods. So maritime spaces actually do not separate, they also connect, and this connection is so important. And the most detailed part of old neutrality law is actually what can be traded while others are at war. Neutral goods on belligerent ships, belligerent goods on neutral ships. It's a fantastic collection of details that was created back then, and it was of course created in the West, which is also why a lot of this jargon actually doesn't fit the global South. And it's one of the reasons why the non-aligned movement explicitly used the term non-alignment, because that is not a Western term. Neutrality is. This is also important to recognize. This neutrality law that we have is basically still part of Western and especially European tradition and history. I would argue, though, it's a useful part of it. And, you know, just why don't we study it very much? Let me show you one of my most important possessions. Look at this. Two huge volumes written up in the late 1930s, early 1940s about neutrality legislation. A compendium of all the neutrality legislation that Mr. Jessup could find, Mr. Jessup being an American professor. And why do we find a lot of Americans who studied neutrality before 1940? Because the United States was a neutral power during the entire 19th century. They also were hegemonic. They also had the Monroe Doctrine. So it's a mistake to think that neutrality automatically means that you're peaceful. Unfortunately, it's not. We have a lot of examples of very belligerent states that are also neutral in one aspect. And the United States is one of them. They were neutral towards the Europeans because they said, we have nothing to do with you guys. If you want to go and kill each other, go have fun. I don't care. I will just insist on my goddamn right to trade with all of you. And it's, of course, then highly ironic that it's today the United States that tries to tell everybody else that you're not allowed to trade with Russia or not allowed to get oil from here or from there. But that's because now they are the hegemon, right? They have an interest in imposing their system. And this, we live in an imperfect world where we academics, we come up with fancy concepts and so on that then also try to explain the entire world. But what we then usually find is that the real world is a messy place. So in theory, something like the United Nations, which is a concept of all for one, one for all, and peace imposed from above by by everybody together, and then we impose peace, shouldn't go together with something like neutrality, because neutrality is the idea of peace from below, as you correctly pointed out, right? You create spaces between, you make it more difficult for attacks. And actually Professor Marandi from Iran says, like, if the Gulf states are properly neutral, if they do not provide their airspace and their land as a place where the United States can then start and launch its attacks, then the war would be over, because the United States wouldn't have the capacity. It wouldn't be possible for it to launch the missile, rocket and bomber attacks on Iran. It does, and that is true. So these cordons sanitaires, these spaces that then create physical distance between potential enemies, that is a stabilizing factor. But it's also against the interest of the idea of we impose peace from above, because it means that you do not rally together all on the one roof and then play a global policeman. So these are two kind of contradictory approaches toward peace. But in reality, what we see is, of course, that we have both. We have a United Nations that is imperfect, and we have neutrality that doesn't create world peace. So we must live with the fact that for the time being, we don't have an order that either adheres to one logic or the other, but we have both that kind of go hand in hand or go next to each other. I would say that if we as academics do a good job, then we can maybe figure out how to use the best of both worlds. And also, in my presentation, I should actually have included maybe one of the most important global South thinkers of the time, who also developed concepts of neutrality at the same time as Mr. Thucydides did. Thucydides 400 years ago did that in Greece, and Mr. Kautilya, the Indian great strategic thinker, did it in India. And there's a completely different set that he developed of how to think about, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or the friend of my enemy is also my enemy, and how he created circles, actually, a mandala theory and a mandala conception within which a couple of these concept can and should be translated as neutrality, but they're based on a different tradition. Now, these different traditions are utterly important, because again, I think in the global South, and especially in Southeast Asia, especially also in South Asia, there is by far more of a space also for conceiving and thinking about third ways. And if you think about it, the NAM movement tried very much to drive the point home that the Cold War is not at all a two-block contestation. It's like, guys, don't forget about us. We're not with neither of you. But that never went down in the West. The West never wrapped its head around that it's not a bipolar situation. Until this day, they pretend that it was a bipolar situation. It wasn't. It was a multipolar situation, but you chose to pretend that it is not because you look down on those, right? And the difference that we have now in the modern multipolarity is that ability to just ignore the global South, that is gone, because the global South is now here, and it is able to assert itself, and that's why sovereignty is so important. Without sovereignty, you can't be neutral. The First and Second World Wars were only world wars because those European and American nations colonized everybody else. I mean, Malaysia and Indonesia and you know, the Dutch East Indies and so on, they would have never gone to war with the Germans or whatnot had it not been for colonialism, right? And in this sense, the Europeans still have a hard time to wrap their head around the idea that their problems are not the world's problems, because they're used to that. And that's what Mr. Shankar actually said, right? That whatever happens in Belgium must then become a world war, because obviously everybody is under our tutelage. Now that tutelage is gone, which gives me the hope that actually the sovereignty of the global South will be strong enough in order to say no, because saying no to the wars of others is actually really difficult, and asserting your right to maintain a relationship is difficult. But maybe I leave it at that and open the floor for more questions.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Pascal lottaz and Dr. Mira Alatas, for the opinions and the extension discussion in the area of Southeast Asia. Doctor, before we go to the audience questions, may I ask one question perhaps? So you mentioned about the neutrality and non-state actors. I want to ask, as you already present on Oman and Switzerland, may I ask about Qatar, where Qatar is a country that hosts a meeting between Hamas, and also they have a US military base in Qatar. So would you consider Qatar is being in a neutral state, and would being a neutral state also includes being a neutral between state and non-state actors like Hamas or any Islamic movements or non-state actors, Islamic movements? Yeah, that's pretty much the question.
Yeah, here I would recommend to look at the conflict that you mean. It's quite interesting. Qatar is definitely neutral when it comes to, or can play the role of a neutral mediator when it comes to Hamas and Israel, while of course being a military base provider to the United States. So Qatar is not neutral in the sense of being a permanent neutral state that builds its foreign policy around neutral principles, but depending on the conflict or depending on the pair of partners, sometimes it ends up in that relationship. It's also because Qatar has, of course, not the best of all relationships with also with Saudi Arabia. I mean, these states have their internal beef with each other, and depending on which one it is, there are neutral spaces open. Qatar shows that. I mean, I recommend not to think of neutrality as an absolute thing. Only very, very few countries use it as an absolute foreign policy. Most states, and most times in history, every time when it matters, it was more of a relational issue, of a non-permanent issue, when states choose to be neutral toward one conflict or another. For instance, and just the most important neutrality of the Second World War, in my view, because it would have changed the course of the Second World War, was the neutrality of Japan vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union vis-a-vis Japan. The two powers had a neutrality pact, a literal neutrality pact, not a non-aggression pact, a neutrality pact, that had a different meaning from the non-aggression pact. And for 4 years, they maintained that neutrality. So while Japan was fighting the US and the Allies, and Russia was fighting, the Soviet Union was fighting the Axis, Germany and Italy, so the friends of Japan, while they were doing that, they maintained a neutrality toward each other. Had they not done so, the entire Second World War would have developed in a completely different direction. So, there are moments when actors toward each other keep maintaining a friendly relationship, maybe not because they like each other very much, but because it is the most rational thing for both of them to do at that moment. And this also goes back to something Dr. Alatas said, this idea that you also have the right to use your sovereignty to do what's good for you and to maintain a relationship that makes sense with everybody that you do. And this of course then requires states to take a sovereign position, to take an independent position. And this is where Bebas Active actually encapsulates exactly that aspect. That there's nothing to be ashamed of for not choosing sides, because not choosing the side of anyone else means simply that you choose your own side. And That's what states are supposed to do. They're supposed to look after their own people. I mean, states who, some of the worst crimes in human history were done by leaders who started saying that they are not responsible just for their own flock, but for a grand idea, that they need to defend the grand idea. And they did the most horrible of crimes in that name. So focusing on what's good for yourself and for your people is actually usually a very pragmatic way of trying to maintain some kind of sanity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pascal. Okay, now we open to the floor. Anyone who have questions can just open your mic and direct your questions either to Dr. Pascal or Dr. Munirah Alatas.
I think, Pascal, one question is directed to you. The first question.
Okay, from Mizani Christos Johannes. The question is in regard to the notion of collective security, which relies on the UN Charter to address violators and international law. This is quite different to the idea of friend to all or to none, whereby the wronged were addressed collectively by the UNGE through resolutions and sanctions, and the wrong party or victim is defeated and supported also collectively through the UN system. So this is one way of asserting strength in numbers by weaker countries in relation to superpowers within the UN. What's your response?
Yeah. No, precisely. That's absolutely correct. Like in theory, collective security and neutrality are mutually exclusive, in theory. In practice, what we do see is that, when the United Nations was founded, Switzerland actually refused to join because of that point, because they said, like, no, it's not compatible with our neutrality policy. Switzerland joined back in 2002, once the United Nations had reached what is called like a universal character. So by now, the way that neutral countries like Switzerland or Austria are squaring the circle is by saying that when we have a Security Council resolution and we have an agreement of all the great powers, then if collective security is activated, what you do is you don't activate a war, you activate a policing an international policing mission, and we can be part of that because it happens with the complete agreement of basically everybody except for the state that has to be policed. In practice, of course, what we see is that that exactly this kind of great power nature of the Security Council then prevents any kind of hard Security Council resolution, especially when for interventions to be taken, and that's then when the traditional law of neutrality again kicks in. But this is really just a way to square the circle. In theory, it's correct that collective security and neutrality are mutually exclusive, but as I said, like, we live in an imperfect world where a lot of these things and also tend to mix. You already had neutral countries joining the United Nations very, very soon, since 1948, right after they were created, and more of them joining over time. It's still a pragmatist world. But I completely agree. And again, like, collective security is the idea of peace top down, and neutrality is the approach of let peace break out bottom up. And that's why it also comes up again and again. It's a natural idea. You don't need academics like me or others or such fat books in order for people to have the idea, hey, how about we just don't go to war if it's not good for us? How about we do what's good for us? I mean, this is a very natural idea, and that's why it keeps coming up again and again and again, and that's why we find it also 2,400 years ago. And if we had older texts, I swear to God, we would find it there too.
Well, one thing I'd like to interject here about ASEAN and about the criticism against ASEAN. I mean, I have myself a lot of criticism in terms of internally how ASEAN is dealing with certain problems that we have. We are not taking enough of a step of kicking out certain members, which should be kicked out, in my opinion. But as a regional grouping that has decided to be neutral, or non-aligned, you know, we have been told we are a talk shop. We don't take a stand. You know, we don't seem to be matured enough to read China. And I mean, this kind of pushback, or rather, we need a pushback from scholars, whether they are based in ASEAN or outside, scholars who are well versed in you know, neutral studies, to actually counter this argument, because the criticism is coming from the global north.
Yeah.
It's coming from them, and we've got to, I don't like to use the word defend, but we've got to take hold of our historical tradition and stick to it, because it is what has guided us till today, and it is what has kept the region free of all the mess that's happening elsewhere in the world.
You are so right. You are so correct. And whenever somebody says that, I mean, especially from the global north, you should look at them and just tell them, look, coming from somebody who's fought 2 world wars and Napoleonic wars, who killed tens of millions of people, and you still tell us that we should emulate that? I mean, would it make it any kind of better if ASEAN just collectively invaded Myanmar and put down like whatever it is that needs to be put down? It would just make everything worse. It would just have more people dying. The talk shop approach maybe doesn't bring world peace, but at least not world war. I mean, it's a very, very self-serving argument from the global north. I mean, especially the Europeans, and they used to look down on ASEAN for the longest time and say, like, you have to imitate the EU. Nah. The EU is so much of a failed project that by now the only ones who still believe in it are the dogmatic lunatics inside Brussels. And I'm sorry that I say that, but it's really, the EU is at such a sad moment, and it has no future. ASEAN has, because it is built differently, because it is built upon multilateral ideals. And yes, it deadlocks you. Yes, it makes certain things impossible. But the EU is on a path straight into another war with Russia. They're dead set to do that, and it will again cost millions of lives. It already cost like hundreds of thousands of lives in Ukraine, and they're doing that. It's not a bug. This is a feature. This is how that system runs. So I encourage you to just tell them that, and then see how they react.
Okay, sorry, I'm going to just mention one more thing about this, since we're still on this topic. Yes, while ASEAN is great and it has kept the peace, there is one problem though, which I see developing throughout the globe actually, and it's this problem of corruption.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a serious problem, because in terms of how big powers deal with relationships with other countries, whether they are small or medium powers, or whether they are on an equal relationship, the idea of corruption, the strategy of corrupt entanglements because of neoliberal desires to produce and to build and to make connections, build railways constructions across the globe. All I'm saying is this has to be addressed in IR discourse as well, and it's not being discussed because it's being compartmentalized into other disciplines like sociology or you know, other disciplines, but it has to find its way into IR. I have recently retired from the university, so I guess I don't know if there are any, you're younger, Pascal, but we need to spread this message out to IR scholars that it is no longer, it should no longer be, it should be multidisciplinary. Whether we like it or not, the issues affecting ordinary people's lives are found in reading material and curriculum of sociology, anthropology, literature, poetry. It has to find its way into IR. And that's why, as you, going back to what you said about IR being founded at the end of World War I, to me, it is a specific hegemonic project. IR actually is a hegemonic project. And I could unpack it, in several ways, but I think you get the idea.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is, we need to decolonize IR. But that would also mean, doing away with a couple of traditions that we so grew accustomed to, right? Realism, liberalism, constructivism. I mean, it's kind of, that's how we structure all of our courses. But we need that's our mistake. That's actually not IR that imposes it. That's just because we kind of think that's how it should be taught. No, you could approach an IR 101 class by just teaching, for instance, start with the Mongol Empire, and then go from the Mongols and go to the Vietnamese, and then teach that, and then maybe look at what we know about how the Aborigines in Australia used to structure themselves sociologically and in what kind of clans they were living. That we could do that, we just don't. So no, you're absolutely right, and this I mean, academia itself, it's not just IR, it's academia which is structured in a way that the colonial North used to think of higher education, right? So we could take that discussion all the way up there. When it comes to corruption, the most useful thing I was ever told was by Peter Katzenstein, who told me, look, don't call it corruption. Corruption's everywhere. The question is corruption legally baked into the system, or is it done under the table? When it's legally baked into the system, like in the United States with lobbying and whatnot, that has just as much an impact on how politics works as it does somewhere in rural Southeast Asia, where you just have to pay the guy, in order to get the goddamn license. But it has a political impact, right? It has a system impact. So he said, like, don't call it corruption, just call it money politics. And then analyze money politics and do it comparatively in order to understand the differences. And I found that a very, very useful comment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pascal and Dr. Munira, for the very engaging discussions, question and answers. It's a very eye-opening, even for me, the Masters IR students. And I put in the chat if Dr. Munira and Dr. Pascal have suggestion of readings or books for us who are interested in international relations to further deepen how can we understand more in the idea of de-westernized international relations theory. You might share with us if you please. All right. So I think there's no other questions. So before we end our session, may I just give Pascal and Dr. Munira maybe some conclusions or some last words about our topic today, regards to neutrality and perhaps the discussion relates to IR. Dr. Pascal, please, and then we move to Dr. Munira.
Well, just very briefly, thank you very much for your interest. Thank you very much for the engaged discussion. Also, Dr. Lottaz, it was a pleasure to hear all of your thoughts on this. My basic contestation is that, as you also said, that reframing international relations is very, very important. Being aware of the colonial aspects of it, and that we can use, when we can study IR in a way outside of the regular framework. If we do so, you will also naturally always bump back into neutrality. And if we do it in a constructive manner that helps us thinking, that helps us make sense of the world as it was and as it is, then we might have a chance, of linking up with a very old project, which is called peace. Most of us like it. There's a couple of people who want war, but most people don't want it. And we are an 8 billion planet. We are 8 billion people, and we are condemned to self-organization, which is one of the main problems. And if we study these different tools in the toolbox correctly, then maybe we can finally figure out how to improve the plumbing of our house so that it's not constantly flooded with war. That would be my goal. So let's go and study the different tools. Neutrality is one of the tools. It's not the only one. It's maybe not the best, but it is one of the tools, and we ought to study it.
Okay, thank you, Pascal. That was great. My last words, my last dinner. No, I guess I would say make 2 points. First of all, I like the idea of decolonizing how IR is taught, how we write about it, how we engage in discourse. But let's not, bandy the word too freely. Decolonize means to be more inclusive in the concepts that we use. The other aspect of it, and actually this is close to my heart, which is I'm actually on the last chapter of writing my fourth book, which is decolonizing the university. And I'm doing it from the perspective of the Malaysian Public University. There are huge problems, and it's linked to the neoliberal system that's out there, that it's linked to the world order that we are condemned to suffer under. And in that connection, my last point is, pay attention to what is happening in West Asia right now, because what Iran is doing is a glimmer of hope for the rest of the global majority. Okay, the global south, the developing world, I'm not saying we hope to go to war, because remember, I'm not saying, I do not believe Iran has made the first move to start the war. They were attacked. But the response to it is what we have to learn and pay attention to. The guarded response, the resilience, the controlling of the narrative. Iran has succeeded in doing that. Succeeded in actually controlling the way the negotiations go. So to make a long comment short, I think the US or Western powers are a bit shocked to see that the pushback coming from a third world Iranian country, a global South country, is actually transforming world order. I mean, this is a huge thing. So we in the rest of the global South, the global majority, we need to consider this and really take note and include this in what we teach, how we verbalize whatever field we are doing, be it the social sciences or even the hard sciences. So pay attention to what's going on around you, whether you are an engineer, a chemist, or a sociologist. And that's my plea to all of us. Thank you. And thank you, Citizens International, for inviting me, for inviting us.
Thank you for organizing. It's a brilliant event.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Citizen International. And thank you so much to Dr. Pascal and Dr. Munira for a very important take-home message, I guess. And last but not least, thank you so much for participants. I hope that today's discussions widen our horizon on how we see today's conflict, today's world. And discussing neutrality doesn't mean we don't have a stance, but the stance is when we are being neutral, it's choosing ourselves and hashtag not our war. But thank you so much, everyone. We will be sharing the recordings to all participants today. And also Dr. Pascal will share his slide for us. Perhaps there's some books there for us to read. All right. Before we finish, I pass the floor to our organizer, Mr. Imran Rasif from Citizens
Thank you,
International.
Huza. Nothing much for me, really. I mean, just wanted to thanks everybody for joining in. I mean, for more information on this particular topics, I mean, I know that Dr. Pascal has a YouTube channel, Neutrality Studies, as well. You can also, and I've been looking at some of the content that they produced there. It's brilliant stuff, more in-depth discussion, all kind of issues are being covered in that particular group. I mean, we will sort of having a follow-up communications via email, basically sharing some reading materials as well as some of the relevant YouTube recordings that's relevant for the topics today. Once again, thank you very much. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Munira Lottaz, for being here. Let's hope to see each other in the next meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.